Good evening, everybody. Good evening. I'd like to welcome you all here tonight to the third Singapore Testing Forum. It'll be the last one this year, unsurprisingly, but we'll be continuing on next year, probably looking in February for the next event. From the sponsors here tonight, we have a few representatives. There's from the testing consultancy, there's myself, there's Mike, there's Melissa, you probably met at the door, and AJ, sitting in the third row there. And representing Tricentis, we have Dominik. Dominik, can you wave a hand? So if you have any questions about the event or the format of the event or suggestions going forward, obviously we have feedback forms, but if you want to discuss with us also, then feel free. But on behalf of our sponsors, I'd like to say how pleased and proud we are to have been working with Leah over the course of the year to bring these events to you here in Singapore, and creating great attendance from the Singapore testing community. And also judging by the number of faces that we're seeing here coming back time and time again, we're seeing that Leah's vision of building a community for the testers here in Singapore, some place where we can come, discuss ideas and exchange ideas across businesses, across industries, really seems to be coming to pass. So that's wonderful. The format of the event tonight is similar to past events. So shortly I'll be introducing the first speaker, Leah, who will have about 20-minute presentation. We'll be following that up with a 10-minute Q&A. After that, we'll break for about 20 to 30 minutes for more refreshments, chance to network, catch up with colleagues and friends. And then I'll be introducing our second speaker for another presentation and QA session. So I guess we'll be finishing up about 8:30 tonight. We've started this one slightly later than previous nights. We had some feedback that a little later would be better. So if this works for you, then maybe make a note on the forms, or if you prefer the earlier session, then maybe go back to that. Okay, so our first speaker tonight needs no introduction to many of you who know her personally or who have attended previous events, but let me introduce anyway. This is Leah Stockley, author of InspiredTester.com, a highly experienced tester, test manager, test director. We'll be presenting our first topic on continuing the theme of context-driven testing, the specifics tonight being risk-based test design. Leah.
Thank you, Tim. Thanks everyone for coming back again, or some of the new faces. Can you hear me okay? Be back. Okay. I would like to quickly point out before it disappears, or you saw it already, that we've finally got our website launched, so I'm sure some of you have seen that, and I know a few of you registered through that, but if you haven't seen it, it's up and running. It will tell you about the next event. It has videos of previous events. And there's also a discussion forum, so you don't have to wait to talk to each other for these events now. You can have online discussions and keep the conversation going and build a community that way as well. So please, it's your website, feel free to use it, suggest improvements, etc. And you can just keep building this community for you. Okay?
SingaporeTestingForum.org.
Yeah, mention that. Okay, so those of you that have heard my previous talks, context-driven testing in a nutshell is ultimately the basic foundation of that is the skill of testers. Not encouraging testing to be a factory, unskilled profession. You are all here, you're all passionate about testing. It's a difficult job, it has many aspects to it, and it's all about improving continually the skills that we have as testers. So one of those that I want to talk to you about today is risk-based test design. So as we know as testers, there are sometimes rigid, very strict processes, and there are reasons why they're needed and they have to be followed, and that's absolutely fair enough. But that isn't always the case, and sometimes we can be a bit more flexible, a bit more dynamic and faster with the processes that we choose to use. The important thing for us as testers is that we have many skills and many tools in our kit bag that we can pick the right one for the right project. So context-driven testing, knowing the context of your project and doing the right thing at that time. Okay. My slides are going back. Yeah. Okay. So most of you here are testers, not everybody, but most people here are testing professionals, and you don't need me to tell you how to design tests. It's bread and butter stuff, and you do it all the time. But and you probably are well conversed or familiar with risk-based testing. So traditionally, we spend a lot of time designing our tests up front very meticulously, get that signed off, that's fine. But do you ever find yourself in a situation where development may deliver a little later than planned, but no one's going to give us extra time to test? That deadline sticks, right? So we often use risk-based testing as a way of determining, okay, we wrote all these wonderful tests, but now let's look at the risk profile and decide which of those tests we can no longer run. We'd love to run them all, but we can't, so lower risk tests are going to disappear off the schedule. Sound familiar? A few nods from around the room. So, and that works, fair enough, it's a perfectly valid technique. But maybe we could ask ourselves, could we have used our time better in the first place? So if we spent 6 weeks designing those tests, and ultimately 20% of them are never going to get used, could we have used that 20% of our time in a more productive way for the project? Maybe we could have got our hands on, sat with the developers, had a sneaky look at the software and started finding some defects a bit earlier. Might not be the perfect formal SIT, but we could have got in and helped find some issues before we ever got to formal testing. So we have to continually ask ourselves as testers, are we using our time in the most effective way? And that can be considered even at test design stage. So we're familiar with that risk-based testing model, but I want to propose what I'm calling risk-based test design. And this is really turning that activity on its head a little bit. So instead of doing all that upfront work, designing those lovely, perfect tests, getting them all signed off, and then de-risking a load of that work, why not do the risk analysis before you do that test design effort? So start with thinking about the risk. Determine from that what is important for the project to test, and therefore you only spend your time creating tests that are going to be executed for the project. Your time is then valuable to the project team. So this is the sort of process that I would suggest for risk-based test design. You start with the analysis. That's no different to any other good testing effort. Before you can decide what to test, you need to analyse your system, understand it, know the requirements, etc. That doesn't go away. But instead of then launching straight into test design, why not brainstorm with your team members, whoever's available, with your stakeholders if possible, and determine what the product risks are. And I'll talk a little bit more about product risks in a moment and explain what I mean by that. But so a lot of you who were here last time would have seen the analysis session that Manu helped run for me, creating that mind map and building a map of everything we could test. But we can then brainstorm separately what are the risks in the system and create a list of risks. Very important, then prioritise those in agreement with your stakeholders or whoever has to make a decision about whether this product goes to production, whether it goes live or not. So get that prioritisation agreed. And you're then, of course, free to go and design detailed tests if you want. Or what a lot of the projects that have tried this are amazed to find is you might not need to go and write such detailed tests when you've done this level of analysis, because it will actually be quite clear to you what needs to be tested. And you can spend less time documentation and more time getting hands-on and actually testing the product. And if you don't believe me, we'll have a go at creating some of these in a minute, so you can see how that looks, and we'll try it out. Okay. So, I mentioned about product risks. So the way that I see it, there are two kinds of risk in the average testing project. One is project risk, one is product risk. So, start with the easy one, project risk. How many of you have test plans for your projects? And in those test plans, are there risk lists? Like quick show of hands, do you have a risk list in your test plan? And does it contain elements such as, if we don't get the environment in time, we won't start testing? Or if the release isn't here on time, we can't test. If we don't have enough testers, we can't test. These are things that I would classify as a project risk. So basically, these are things that will stop us testing, or delay us, or prevent us from hitting our deadline that we've agreed. So they're project risks, and we might engage the project manager to help resolve those and make sure they don't trip us up. So what then might I mean by product risk? To anyone who's not been on my training.
Maybe an operational risk of the product, or financial risk,
Yeah.
or usability risk.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Great examples. So things that could go wrong with the product or the software, or whatever that product is, once it goes to production. And how many of you do any of you do that kind of analysis before you design the tests at the moment? Is it something you sit down and go, what could go wrong with this? Or do we typically base our testing against the spec? We just kind of, we'll focus on proving that these requirements are there or not. It's kind of more traditional. So, what I'm talking about with risk-based test design is coming up with a list of risks to the product, things that could go wrong when it's in operation. Financial risk, reputational risk could be to the company. Whatever could go wrong. And I would class it as a product risk because we can mitigate it with a test or several tests. So a project risk you mitigate by some planning or something, but a product risk you mitigate by running a test to prove, is this going to happen in production or not? Well, to do your best to prove whether it's going to happen in production or not. Is that distinction kind of clear? Yeah. So as an example, if you have an internet banking application, a major product risk would be that the user can't log on. If the user can't log in, the rest of the website's pointless. Or if the timeout doesn't work, then the security of that user's account could be at risk. So these are kind of potential risks, maybe of an internet banking application. Okay. So what I want to do now is get you guys to help me spend maybe 5 minutes and see what product risks we can come up with. So do you remember, those of you who were here last time, the analysis session we did was on an iPhone 5. So it's a pretty handy thing. Most people are familiar with it, or a smartphone. So I'm going to carry on that theme. It's not as clear as I was hoping it would be, but this is what we created last time. We did a brainstorm and analysis of some of the things that we could possibly test on an iPhone 5. So what we need to do now, we wouldn't be able to test necessarily all of these, so we're going to create a product risk log and use that to help narrow down what we may actually test, or certainly what we're going to prioritise in terms of testing. Okay? This is just a reference, by the way. I'm sure you can come up with many ideas that might not even be on here, because this was by no way complete. We spent 10 minutes on it. So I'll ask for some ideas in a minute. I guess one other thing I would say, when I create these product risk lists, the projects that found them most useful, write them in a kind of user story way. So to give an example of an iPhone, anyone as clumsy as me and drops their phone regularly? I do all the time. So I would say there's a product risk if you've designed a new phone and it's all new material, new design. So it's a hardware risk that if I drop this and it smashes the first time, I'm going to be pretty upset as a consumer. And if that reputation gets out, people are not going to buy the phone because we use it all day, every day, it gets dropped. So I would say there's a kind of robustness risk in terms of the phone not breaking the first time it's dropped. So that's one kind of risk. So can anyone else suggest any more product risks for an iPhone 5?
The fingerprint reader, either it doesn't work or it works for everyone.
Okay, good. Yeah. I'm just not going to write fast enough. So, prevents access or allows access incorrectly. Yeah, good. Any other? Sorry, say that one again.
Cumbersome interface.
Yeah.
The interface is not so. User experience is not good.
Yeah. User experience, not maybe intuitive or cumbersome. Yeah. There was one about network.
Yeah, no network connection, whether it's Wi-Fi or 3G, 4G, whatever.
Okay. Yeah.
It's good. It's turning your iPhone into a camera.
Battery. Does not last long enough, whatever that might be. Surely that's not true about an iPhone.
Slowness, performance.
Slow performance. So yeah. So, charger.
Of the charger. Come back. Or charge is changing.
Yeah. I'm not sure that's what Apple thought of. Okay.
Compatibility with the other computer systems.
Yeah.
Device.
So, I can't spell. Compatible with other devices or computers. Yeah, you discount the whole market if they only work with Macs, for example. Yeah.
Button operations outside the external button operations.
Don't work as a
Don't work there.
Okay. Oh, Rox. Okay. Yeah. Backup. Data corrupted. I'm sorry, there was another.
No response screen on hanging.
Hanging. Okay. Yeah. Excellent. Loads of ideas.
Draft for platform users. I mean, draft for platform users, those who are using keypads, they are not comfortable using touch phones. I've seen the fumbling or not writing in good film.
Okay. So the screen usage. So maybe is that like an accessibility thing? Or maybe
accessibility in the sense of for older people, they are not very comfortable.
yeah.
The camera, flashlight, no problem.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's similar sort of main functionality, but either camera or the flash not working. Great. Multitasking, yeah, that's a good one as well. Okay. Fantastic. So, in the interest of time, I think I'll stop. But what a great list. That didn't take long. It's maybe not comprehensive for a phone, but look what we've achieved in 5 minutes. Pretty impressive. So then what if I asked you to go and test this now? Do you feel that you would need to write tests for a week? Or actually, are some ideas coming to mind already about how you might test this? So, pick a fairly simple one, external buttons not working. What kind of tests would you run to test whether the external buttons work or not? I won't ask a manager. Any ideas? Like how, what about the power button? What kind of test would you use?
For hardware failure. For hardware, explicit hardware test.
If we're looking at the external buttons? Yeah, it's more of a hardware focus. Okay, should I pick a software one first one? What about the a good one. When backup data corrupts, how would we test? What sort of test would you run? Any ideas?
Check that backup is actually created when you press backup.
Right. So yeah, run a backup. Go and check that a file has been created. Yeah. What else would you do?
Maybe download the new ISO or whatever it is and see and to refresh that.
Yeah. So download a new version of the iOS and then see if that backup is going to work. Or that happened to me recently. It didn't work. Had to delete the backup, recreate.
When you backup, disconnect the USB connector and see if it works.
Yeah, does that corrupt and lose all the backups effectively?
Back in the layman's term, the person who doesn't know about the phone is still using it. He needs to back up some content, or he's upgrading the entire system accordingly. So he wants to have all this information present to the new phone.
Yeah.
So, how we can do it? In a very layman's term.
So even how intuitive is the process to achieve that? Yeah. Great. So there's already a few ideas. That's probably 20-30 minutes worth of testing that's going to give the stakeholders of Apple good information of whether the backup functionality is going to work. So does that make sense as a kind of aid to designing tests? Now, as I said, I'm not saying this is the way we should always design tests at all times. As testers, we have to have many different ways, many different tools in our kit bag that we can use. Excuse me. And this is just my suggestion as another method to use, especially effective when time is short. So if you have a brand new system and you have weeks and months to test it, this might not be the method you choose, although it may still add to the process. But if you get asked, hey, it's 10 o'clock in the morning, at 2 o'clock you're going to get delivery from development, it's got to go to production at 6 o'clock tonight, then this might be a really good way of figuring out what you need to test. You could spend hours trawling through your test management system to see what tests you've got that might fit, or you could just run a session, do some good analysis, do a risk analysis, and know that what you're going to test is going to give important information to your stakeholder about whether that is ready for production or not. Okay. It's highly efficient. It's a very quick way of designing and refining which tests to run. I'm calling it broad because there's ideas here that may never appear in a spec, and this can help generate thoughts of interesting ways and interesting tests to perform that you might not get if you're just purely looking at the functionality from a specification. So it can be a lot broader. It can encourage us to think a little bit differently about how to design our tests. And ultimately, the good thing is you're only going to take and put effort into tests that are going to get run and are going to add value to the project. You're not wasting your time producing tests that ultimately will never give any information out. And as I said, my suggestion, think about user experience. There could be technical risks in here as well, but ultimately think about I think that's my cue, so get off. Ultimately, think about risk to the users, risk to production, risk to the reputation of your company, and then mitigate those risks by running tests to determine whether they exist or not. So in a nutshell, risk-based test design. Any questions? If that makes sense.
So after we come out of that,
Yes. Good point. I forgot to mention that. Yeah, absolutely. Once you've created this list, prioritise that as well. Yeah, it's a good thing to do. You could do high, medium, low. You could literally think, if I could only run one test for one of these, which would it be? And go through that process. And yeah, verify that with whoever's making the ultimate decision about whether this goes live. I think this is a risk. Do you agree? Is it something you care about? If not, we won't test it. So, yeah. Thanks.
Most important thing, never to make noise.
Yeah, items missing from this list. If you can't make a phone call, it's not a great phone.
How do you like to prioritize user experience along with a large data set? I mean, an application running, containing the data, having a huge amount of data information, customer sensitive data information. So how should somebody prioritize while testing that? I mean, if something needs to be delivered quite urgently, so I mean, what should be test scenarios?
So how do you use risk-based?
Exactly, risk-based. And risk associated both in the data segment and the user experience.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you would need to combine both, but I think the process is the same. Think about what data is used the most, or what is the most sensitive, or what could cause the biggest fine for the company if it went wrong. So again, it's thinking about the risk in the data.
So while I completely agree with the theory and the way we can actually do it, but a couple of things. So one thing is that if we, this is prone to problems wherein you may actually miss out the entire scenarios at all, because you are not actually relating it to any coverage kind of methodology. It's more of a one of the mill thoughts. How do you basically use it about the context that. And second point, I see a bit disconnect between how do you ensure coverage with this, because this is more of a context based rather than being a coverage based. Second point, I believe that the people who are actually doing this exercise, you can do this very well with a sort of folks who are very well versed with the domain per se. They need to be experts in the domain, because maybe a lesser knowledgeable person on the domain knowledge may not be a good fit to do this kind of task.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first point about how do we track back coverage, I'm certainly saying when you use this, it might be quite dynamic. You might be doing it when time is short, so you don't have time necessarily to create this perfect traceability matrix back to your requirements. It's still obviously important for us to do a good job and make sure we're covering that point. And that's why the first step in that process was about the analysis. So you still have to spend time doing something like this, making sure you know the system. And I guess it goes to your second point as well, that, you know, to do good skill testing is very hard to do with people that don't know the domain, don't know the business, don't know anything about any of these things. However, a skilled tester has techniques that means they can ask the right questions quickly and get the information they need if they're put in a position where that's what they have to do. So, yeah, it is definitely about the skills of the testers.
I think the first point even came out to the fact that someone pointed, we didn't really talk about making a call or making a text.
Yeah.
So,
And to be fair, we spent 5 minutes.
I understand.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think, you know, when we've done this on a project where the analysis to create something like this
it
is,
needs to marry with the.
yeah, you'd take a bit longer. This might take 2 hours. This takes about 20 minutes, half an hour. Obviously, you would extrapolate that out, and you may spend a couple of hours doing this kind of exhaustive list. If it takes longer than that, it might not be the right technique. So is that okay?
Yeah, when we have multiple versions in the product, so when you categorize the product risk, so we'll really consider the previous version risk that we have already considered, or we start from the beginning for getting the risk for every version. How the approach will be, if you have to consider the previous, then how you have the risks and priorities saved for the previous version, and when you comparing with the new version, then again how you reprioritize the risk.
Yeah, I mean, you can, so if you have a previous risk list, then it's a great reference point before going into this session. In terms of what you would do for a new version, you'd focus on the change. I mean, I think this is where this is most powerful, because you don't necessarily need to functionally test everything, and if you know the changes only affect 5% of your application, you can focus, this is where the risk of this version are, and therefore this is the testing that we'll focus on. Does that make sense?
So depends upon the new features that you are going to add. Again, we have to reprioritize.
Yeah, I would suggest so, because things change, and the same tests that caught bugs last time might not catch them this time if that functionality is working well and hasn't been affected. So, yeah, for the sake of half an hour that session might take, I think it's worth reprioritising or checking those priorities at least.
Actually, we also do impact analysis. So for one version, the next version is coming. So what will be the impact? So we discuss with the developers and see what is the impact, the code impact as such. And so accordingly, you can identify which are the risk levels. So it's like we do an impact analysis for this version, what will be the impacts, which are the functions will get impacted because of this change in the version. So that will also help you in terms of analyzing between versions.
What I was expecting is that if there is nothing to take as a methodology to define based on this specific requirement, it will come as a high priority kind of that. So, what is the base to define this is high priority? So, only the end user requirement, or
I would suggest a combination of things. So yeah, what's important to the user or the buyer? Where are the technical risks? So your development team can definitely help say, this is a bit risky, this code change, or we'd like you to focus here, then you'd get some technical risk. It could be any number of things, anything that presents a risk when it's in production, then you should be including it on.
Okay, do we have any more questions?
This will even work even better with a Scrum Teams model, wherein you have a diverse team, maybe getting input from all kind of, you have a product owner, you have a UX person, you have a SWD, you have the PDs.
Yeah, I think so.
It may even work even better than that.
Yeah, the more brains, the different
More perspectives actually.
More perspectives, yeah. It'd be great. Do you agree, Al?
Yeah.
Runs on agility.
Okay, that's great. more tea, coffee, refreshments over there. We'll maybe shorten the break to maybe 20 minutes, and we'll introduce the second speaker at that point.